Do you like carbon? Are you looking to right bike? Do you want a trail bike and not a trailhead bike? Well, pay attention in this video because though these sound like maybe some obscure words to be throwing around, I do have some things to talk about that hopefully make sense of each of those things I talked about. Hey bike geeks, from weight to wheels, price to performance, we're here to just take a close look at bicycles so you can make an educated decision when selecting your next bike. In today's video, we're looking at this brand new 2024 Giant Trance X Advanced 29-2. So first off, when we're talking trances, I always have to basically explain what the heck is going on with a trance name on Giant bikes. There is a Trance X, and a Trance X SX now. A Trance is 120 millimeters of rear travel and 130 millimeter travel fork. There is an alloy version and an advanced version too. Advanced, when we're talking about Giants, means carbon. Then there's this Trance X. This is a brand new design for 2024, which changes it from the previous 135 millimeter rear travel and 150 millimeter travel fork to now being right in line with a lot of other companies' trail bikes with 140 millimeters rear travel and 150 millimeter travel fork. Then there is also a Trance X SX, which means 145 millimeters of rear travel, a mullet setup, meaning a 27.5 rear wheel compared to these being dual 29ers, and 160 mil travel fork on that Trance X SX. In today's video, we're talking specifically about this 2024 Trance X Advanced 29-2. So that 140, 150 carbon, a true trail bike. This particular one we're talking about is $58.99 in Canada, and it is 31.7 pounds, which is actually a surprisingly respectable weight in the trail bike category these days. As we get into this video, I am going to describe more about this bike, why I consider it a true trail bike and not a trailhead bike, and what that crazy terminology actually means, what right biking means, and we're going to go over a bunch of things. And I'll admit a bias. I absolutely love this bike. I love the concept of this bike and a number of things about this bike. So I am going to be totally honest and let you know up front that I love it, because I can't even think of a single criticism on this bike. So stick with me and we're going to describe this bike, and hopefully by the end of this you'll understand the Trance X better, understand this particular model better, and hopefully it'll give you the ammunition to make a good buying decision on your next trail bike. So during the introduction I brought up two terms, right biking and a trailhead bike. So to start with, right biking is basically the idea of people being on the appropriate bike. In the world of mountain biking, for whatever reason, and I'm very guilty of this, the allure of underbiking or overbiking is really strong. The allure of just being on the bike that does its job best to allow for people to ride all sorts of different terrain almost seems like the last thing that anybody, including myself, has wanted to do in the past. The idea of underbiking is using things like Rocky Mountain Elements or the short travel version of the Trance, the 120 rear travel version, to basically ride enduro style, free ride-ish type trails. And the idea of overbiking is using a full-on enduro bike to go trail riding on. This bike, with its 140 rear travel and 150 travel fork, is a true trail bike. This is right biking. It is a bike designed as much for the ups as the downs, and those roly-poly trails that are just all over the place, meandering. This is the bike that does all the things really well. I would consider even using this in a marathon race, any marathon race that actually had some fun downs, and I would also consider racing a local enduro on this bike. That is how widely capable this bike is, and I think in all of the settings it's going to be super fun, confidence inspiring, and not really pay any sort of a penalty. The other idea I brought up was the trailhead bike instead of the trail bike. A trail bike, as I just finished mentioning, is designed for all those things, all the types of trails you might want to ride. A trailhead bike is designed to be ultra expensive and something that you get to brag about as you're pulling it off your Tacoma in the parking lot. This is not that bike. There is nothing glaring about this bike except for the fact that it's got this beautiful sparkling red paint job, but there are no bold brandings on here, on the rims, none of the components on here. This is a sleeper of a bike, and I'm going to describe to you, as I talk about the components on this bike, why this is such an amazing trail bike without being a trailhead bike at all. This isn't a bike to be bragged about, it's a bike to be ridden. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So we'll start with some numbers. 31.7 pounds, that is the weight of the size large as weighed in the shop about an hour ago. Price on this bike, $58.99 in Canada. A sad thing, as I always do on these videos, I go looking at the US Giant website and they do not list this model. It looks to me like they still have too many of the previous model which they're trying to sell off. So in the States at the moment, they only list the two models above this, which are in USD prices $7,000 or $8,000. That's the Advanced 1 or the Advanced 0. Those bikes are also available in Canada at $8,500 or $10,500. And as far as I'm concerned, I would not be at all interested in those bikes because this bike does everything I would want my trail bike to do. More numbers. Head tube angle on this bike, 64.8 degrees plus or minus 0.4 degrees depending on your flip chip. Seat tube angle, 77.5 plus or minus 0.4 degrees. Once again, depending on that flip chip. The reach on this large is 480 millimeters, and then that will be plus or minus about 8 millimeters, and that will depend on that flip chip and that flip chip. So that one there especially is going to be a discussion. Chainstay length, 439 millimeters plus or minus 1 millimeter, and that goes back to that flip chip, which has a tiny effect on chainstay length. So those are a bunch of numbers. I think in total, if we look at geometry on this bike, this is as close to spot on, nothing radical, nothing missed, just a spot on good trail bike geometry. As I mentioned those flip chips, I'll just show you a couple of things here. So for example, on the headset here, this is a flip chip, not an angle adjust that they have in the headset. Shipped in the box, it is in the neutral position. Also in the box are a separate set that run forward will add 5 millimeters to reach, run backwards will reduce the reach by 5 millimeters. On the back of the bike, once again, flipped in the neutral middle position right there. And then you also have those flip chips which basically will raise or lower the bottom bracket, resulting in some of those head tube angle and seat tube angle adjustments. So that right there is stuff that you'd pretty much expect on really high-end stuff and is great to see on a bike at this price point. What it means in practicality is that is going to affect how your bike rides. That is going to affect how you fit on the bike. And for many people, it's going to mean that there is no longer sort of an awkward in-between size, that you'll be able to basically see the sizes as a spectrum from small to XL. There are not any mega gaps like there once were on bikes like this. So getting into the spec on this bike, I will just briefly touch on all of the items that we see. We have an SLX 1x12 drivetrain, meaning that we have a 1051 cassette on there. It is an SLX cassette, not a DR cassette. Of course, an SLX derailleur and SLX shifters. So nothing out of the ordinary there. Cranks are these Shimano Dior cranks with a 30 tooth chainring on there, narrow wide. It is a steel chainring, meaning it's going to be the first couple rides is probably going to sound a little bit poppy is what I find with a narrow wide that's made out of steel, but you will get pretty excellent chain life out of, or chain ring life out of having a steel ring on there. These cranks, appropriately sized, 165 in the smallest size, and I think 170 on all of the others. Tires, Maxxis Dissector 29 by 2.4, setup tubeless with XO casing. So this is a lightweight and very practical rear fast rolling tire. On the front we look at a Minion DHF in a 29 by 2.5, also in that XO casing, setup tubeless from the factory. Now a massive highlight of this bike is this brand new Giant TRX wheel set, and it is a standout for a few reasons here. So to start with, I mean, even seeing a carbon wheel set on a $5,900 bike is pretty outstanding. That hasn't been that unusual for Giant for the last number of years. They've been able to provide, because they're the world's biggest bike manufacturer and they do their carbon manufacturing in-house, they've been able to put carbon wheels on bikes now for about the last 6 or 7 years that would have been in this price point. The first round of wheels they did were crap. The second round of wheels were quite good carbon wheels. This third round of wheels, I would say that we're getting into really high performance stuff. And what they're doing to make them high performance is it is a pretty slim profile as far as the depth of the rim. The width of the rim is impressive. It's 30 millimeters internal, but 40 millimeters external. What that means is that you've got a really wide shelf that your tire is fitting in behind. And if you ever do actually like smash through a soft tire all the way down, having that 5 millimeter shelf on either side is going to both protect your tire and protect your rim. This relatively flat profile here is also going to give us some really good compliance. So a number of things there that are much more in line with things like VR1 convergence wheels, or what they're designing those wheels to do, and less so just being a carbon wheel for the sake of the material. So a very impressive step there. Another impressive step is the fact that at this first price point, we're used to seeing on all the previous year's bikes a pretty cheap hub. This time around, not so much. We have straight pole spokes, and we are now down to a 5-degree engagement on here. So both the sound, which is always nice but not overly important, the sound is good, but we have basically a pretty fast engaging hub there. So this is getting awfully close, as I just watched a video yesterday on the new DT Swiss wheels that there was all sorts of fuss about with their 4 degrees of engagement. This is 5 degrees, and this is on, once again, a $5,900 bike, basically coming with wheels that if you went and bought them separately are $2,000 and worth every penny of that $2,000, I would say. Moving ahead, we have, as always, the really good chainstay protection, bottom of the chainstay protection, and seat stay protection on here. So they're looking after the paint. The one thing I would say, if you were going to criticize Giant over the last number of years, is they quite often have good looking paint jobs, but they tend not to be super durable, at least, and you quite often will see a little bit of chipping in areas around here. To be seen if this is going to be one of those paint jobs or not. But I mean, if you're concerned, you basically end up doing something to just wrap, especially this area right here. That tends to be the most prone. We have Maestro suspension, and we have some new design details as far as that rear triangle. When we're talking Maestro, basically it means this whole thing here is one piece, and then we have these short dual links. That is the actual patent, is on this combination of dual links, and what they result in is a virtual spot in space that would be somewhere about here, and that is where your virtual pivot is. And as you go through the travel, as all of this stuff moves and these arms move, that virtual pivot is going to basically migrate in some sort of a pattern like that. Part of the idea with that is that at the beginning of the pedal stroke, we end up with a bit more anti-squat than we have further into the pedal stroke. And what that gives you is efficiency off the top, but not getting kickback in your pedals as you move through the travel. That is one of the magic things about the Maestro suspension. And it's very much the same story as Pivot with their DW link. A DW link is also a short dual link. They just happen to, the two pivots or two patents somehow can coexist by being ever so slightly different. And a large part of that, looking at the DW link, is usually the links just tend to be a little bit shorter in both the upper and lower positions. A common thing I would say, and something I've certainly found, is that they have very similar characteristics. Those characteristics quite often being that combination of very efficient pedaling, a nice small bump compliance, but a big tendency to fight bottom out. So unless you are seriously under inflated in your rear shock, you're not going to feel anything like going off of a jump, landing, and feeling that thwack at the end of your travel. They really do tend to fight that bottom out feeling. As we're talking about all these things, I should point out that rear end is carbon, that upper rocker link is carbon, the front triangle is carbon. The only thing in this whole setup that is not carbon is that aluminum lower link there. And that, I'm sure, with the engineering power that Giant has behind it, I'm sure if it made any sense at all to make it out of carbon, they could and they would. And obviously it doesn't, because that is still the one link in the whole setup that they have never made out of carbon. Speaking of all of these things, on top of that performance I was speaking of the pedaling efficiency, of the anti-bottom out, of the small bump compliance, another thing about Giant suspension is that you don't tend to see any of these sort of things giving issues down the road. You don't get bolts loosening off as a regular sort of a thing. You don't see bent issues. You do, of course, any shock will end up with DU bushing play at given time, but these tend to be when you have co-rotating, so the two pivots actually rotating in the same direction, you tend to have a little bit better bushing and bearing lifespans, as opposed to some of the VPP linkage where you actually have two links that rotate in opposite directions, which I think just inherently puts a little bit more strain on the bushings or bearings that they have in there. This frame design gives us quite a long section of seat tube there, so that means that we get really good seat post insertions, so you can run a really long dropper and not be forced to ride it too high for any sort of practical height. We have this cargo cage mounting system here, as well as down tube. Speaking of the down tube, that water bottle cage just happens to be placed on top of the down tube storage. It's got a really neat system for taking that off. The little door into the down tube storage isn't that big. That's the only criticism I would say about it. But I would also admit that even though I've been riding things like the new Rain for a little bit, I still haven't used that for really putting anything in there. It's just not in my habit for how I use my bike. Give you an idea of how simply that installs. As I'm holding the camera with one hand, I can lock that into place with the other. Even when you have a bottle cage on there, you can still pop that off. Holding with your bottle, you can pop the whole thing off. In bigger frame designs, like I think on this large, I think I tried it at the shop if I remember correctly. I tried with a small bottle here and a bottle here, and it looked like I might just be able to squeeze actually a tiny bottle in here and down here, but that would be a bike frame specific kind of a detail. Moving forward, one of the things that I really like about all of the new Giant carbon bikes now is this really chunky design detail where the top tube, down tube, head tube meet, and just this kind of sculpting that we have going on there. I think it's just a really aesthetically pleasing look. We have really good down tube padding with all this rubberized stuff that wraps around and basically runs all the way to the bottom bracket here. Up above this, there's even some pretty thick 3M style protection on the paint there. So if you're shuttling or anything, and if that doesn't catch your tailgate pad, you're still going to be resting on some stuff that's protecting the paint from scuffing. Just going back very quickly, I just wanted to show you between the crank spider there is ISCG mounts on here, so if you wanted to run a chain guide of some sort, you could without any problems. This is the new way that the ports are working for the internal cable routing. There is also, if you're ever looking to sort of re-thread cables through or anything, once you take the down tube storage door off here, it basically gives you a way that you can help guide things through the frame there. And then the actual ports, when you take the little screws out and take the ports out, are big enough that there's no issues with trying to feed things through. You're not trying to thread a needle from all the way from up here and somehow magically bend the cable to come out down here. It's easy stuff, and we are fortunately past those huge pain in the butt days of internal cable routing. Going to the rear shock, we're looking at a standard Fox float rear shock on here. This is now a 2-position, so you basically have trail mode when our lever is pointing to the right, and standard open mode pointed to the left. With Giant being as efficient as they are, I am pretty sure I will be in this mode all the time and won't even bother with that mode. It's something that I have thought has been a great selling feature ever since the early days, 2005, 2006, of the first Maestro suspension equipped bikes, is that their mechanical design is such that we're not relying on hydraulic valving stuff to give us some sort of feeling of pedaling efficiency. The stock setup as far as saddles go, this Romero saddle, if you've watched a lot of my Giant videos, you know that I'm a fan of those. We have the new contact switch AT, that's adjustable travel seat post on here. If I was to pull this seat post out of the frame right now, you'd actually see there's a little indent in the seat post down inside the frame there, and that's where the extra shims are placed on the outside to be put inside here to adjust the travel. So it's actually quite a simple thing to do. You spin this collar off, and then you can basically lower by 5, 10, or 30 millimeters, I believe, 5, 10, 20, or 30 millimeters. There's a lot of adjustment there. I, of course, have crazy long legs, so I'll be using every bit of that long dropper travel there. The stem on here, this is a 50 millimeter long stem on this size large. I think once you're down into the smalls and mediums, maybe it was a 40 mil stem, and then the large, extra large gets that 50 mil. The handlebars are Giant's alloy 35 millimeter clamp handlebars, and I think 780 millimeters wide. The one thing that I have had the tendency of, I have no problem actually with the quality of the stem or the bend or anything to do with these handlebars. I do have a thing with just liking to look down at a really beautiful stem, so I wouldn't be surprised if this is the only things that I actually change on this bike, as it's going to be probably my main bike for the next 6 months. Just something that when I look down at it, it just has some appeal, so maybe an I9 stem and probably 1-up bars. That's the only thing that I plan to change on the bike, and it is for no reason other than the emotional wanting to look down at something that's really spiffy. These grips aren't as tiny as some of the stock Giant grips. They are lock-on. They have a pretty grippy feeling rubber. They're actually like, they've got some thought put into them, the actual extra grip stuff down below. These brakes are my favorite Shimano brakes. They're the Dior level 4-piston servo wave brakes, as you often hear me talking about with these brakes. This is essentially the same brake as an SLX or an XT brake as far as everything to do with its function. The only thing it's missing is a bunch of tool-free adjustments that you would usually have on here and one that would be into the top of the lever body here. None of those things mean anything to me. I'm perfectly capable of sticking an Allen key in here, adjusting my preset, and that's all I need to do. I still get servo wave, I still get ceramic pistons at the calipers. There is nothing that I am sacrificing as far as performance by riding this brake, which is, as an aftermarket value, worth about half the price of the XT brake. And as I said, as far as doing the job of a brake to take you from going fast to going slow, it does the same job as an SLX or XT, so I'm happy with it. Just like I am also happy with SLX shifters. I got none of those issues in reviews. You hear people getting really worked up over wanting XT shifters because they want to press through multiple gears at once. I have no issues pushing my thumb or my finger a couple more times rather than one big push or pull. Getting to the front of the bike, we have this Fox 36. This is a Rhythm. What that Rhythm name means to you is the fact that this is an ever so slightly heavier, lower on this fork. As you notice, it doesn't have that smooth round kind of arch on there like we would have if this was actually a Performance Elite or a factory fork. With that comes a tiny little weight increase on this, but we still have a proper grip damper. We still have everything else about a Fox Air fork that does all the things it needs to. So I have absolutely no problems with this fork. It gives us all the performance of a high performance Fox fork without paying all of the extra money. I'll just hop over some lighting cords here. Just to show you, as I mentioned, these 4 piston brakes that are down here. They have the ceramic pistons inside. They have properly sized rotors, meaning we have, I didn't even look this up, but I'm pretty certain that this is a 203 on the front and a 180 on the rear. Yeah, I guess if I had to look for a place to criticize, I do like fancy rotors, and those aren't fancy rotors. But I'll just wait until I bend one when I do something stupid and I drop my bike onto a stump or something, and then I'll put on the fancy Ice Tech rotors. Show you some of the details over here. There's that 180 rotor, just as equally unfancy as the front, but hey, it's a rotor. It can manage either resin or metallic brake pads, which means that it can do most of the things I'll need it to do. So if I wreck a rotor, I'll replace it with an Ice Tech rotor. Once I wore out brake pads on this, if I was going to keep it long enough, I would consider putting finned brake pads in there for the extra heat management. But otherwise, this bike is an amazing $58.99. To sum up, you do not see first price point in carbon trail bikes with absolute top of the line worthy carbon wheels, unless you're looking at a Giant. You do not see all the adjustment of flip chips there on $6,000 bikes with things that are really, really well executed. These are all really high-end features. Everything about this bike is a high-end trail bike, except you just don't have an Envy logo on something, you don't have a fancy one of those cool guy brands on any of the bits and pieces. You just have a bike that is going to work incredibly well. Can you tell I'm a fan of this bike? Can you tell I care about how I spend my money? That is basically the things that this bike does for you. If you care about your money, if you care about the quality of your ride, not just being able to show off to your friends in the parking lot, this is the trail bike for you. The 2024 Giant Trance X Advanced 2. Thanks for watching. If you watched this far, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, let me know what you think about this bike.